Good evening, everyone in Asia, and also good morning to everyone tuning in from Europe and Africa. My name is Karen Pitakdamrongit, Deputy Head of the Center for Multilateral Studies at S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. So first of all, I'd like to thank the Heinrich Foundation for inviting me. I'm very delighted to moderate this webinar, which will highlight the key issue of the corporate subsidies. It's also my pleasure to welcome you all, including our experts who are joining us for this important discussion. So let me first provide a bit of context about the webinar. Corporate subsidies represent a critical problem for global trade and multilateral cooperation. The number of subsidy-related trade disputes has increased sharply since 2010, as have investigations launched into subsidized imports. We are thankful to Simon Evernet and his team at Global Trade Alert for compiling the first comprehensive inventory of the world's 3 largest subsidy regimes, which are China, the EU, and the US. Simon will shortly present the findings of this important report, and we hope today that we can discuss how trading partners can renew cooperation to address the issue of subsidies. Let me now introduce our speakers. I know you have their full bios on the website, but just let me briefly introduce them again. So our discussion today begins with Simon Evernet, the founder of Global Trade Alert. He is the professor of international trade and economic development and MBA director at the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. He also served twice as a World Bank official and is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. The Heinrich Foundation is proud to support the work of the global trade in highlighting issues critical to global trade. Also, we are very honored to have with us Gary Sampson. Gary is John Gosch Professor in the Practice of International Trade at the Melbourne Business School. He is also known for his tenure at GATT and WTO. He was appointed the director at GATT in 1987, and then the director at WTO in 1999, where he directed a number of divisions. So after leaving WTO in 2005, Gary joined Melbourne Business School and also has been teaching at the London School of Economics. And last but not least, we are thankful that Wei Huan Zhou is also with us today. He's a associate professor at the Faculty of Law and Justice, University of New South Wales, Sydney. Prior to joining UNSW, he was a trade and commercial lawyer at a top-tier Australian firm in Sydney. In that capacity, he advised the government of China, Chinese industry associations, and numerous companies in trade remedy investigations. Again, our great thanks to you all for joining us. Now, for you in the audience, let me turn your attention to the Q&A function on the screen. You can send in your questions through this function at any point. We are grateful if you could keep your questions brief, succinct, and limited to one only. Also, please be noted that this session is being recorded and that the recording will be available on our website next week. So with the housekeeping out of the way, let me welcome Simon Evernet to share with us the findings of the Global Trade Alert's latest report. Simon, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen, for that kind introduction. And I must say, I'm very grateful to the Heinrich Foundation for not only supporting this project, but also for the opportunity to share the results with you and with my 2 colleagues on the panel. I'm going to raise some slides here and take you through some of the key findings, if I may. I've raised the slides. If they haven't come up, Karen, please tell me. Very good. So let's move through this. The 28th Global Trade Alert report was published last month, and it covers the important question of corporate subsidies and their implications for market access in the trading system. This report was co-authored with my colleague Johannes Fritz. Now, the purpose of this particular presentation is to summarize the findings and the policy implications of this particular report. But first, let me thank the Heinrich Foundation for supporting this particular report. The resources that were provided allowed us to scale up our subsidy evidence collection effort, which we believe has been substantial. And we have not only collected a lot of information, we've also made it publicly available so that people can download the inventory of this cache of subsidy information and start analyzing it themselves. And I'm happy to see that people are already doing that. I should say that although I'm going to talk about subsidies, please remember that high quality evidence on what public policy is up to and what governments are up to is a global public good. And it's a global public good which has been eroded in the context of the trading system over the last decade or so, and in particular in the area of subsidies, which takes us nicely to the context for this particular study. Now, your listeners may not know this, but the WTO has a system of notification for subsidies, which governments are supposed to comply with. And there's a big disagreement as to whether or not governments are actually complying with that. On top of this, the G20 countries were supposed to notify the WTO of what are called their general economic support measures, often subsidies. And the WTO Secretariat had to stop preparing reports on this information because so few G20 members were complying with this expectation. So what that means is that there is a major knowledge gap on subsidies, and filling that knowledge gap has been a narrative which has been extremely anti-Chinese. So one important part of this narrative is to criticize the Chinese development model for its so-called non-market features, of which subsidies are one part, and to argue that this constitutes a major distortion to the trading system. Now, normally the claims made here, which may be true, but the key thing about these claims is that they have not been backed up by serious evidence. And indeed, if you go back to our 22nd report, we looked very carefully at whether or not the claims made about excess capacity and Chinese excess capacity in particular were valid, and we found that they were not. And so I would caution those people who follow the trading system, who've heard this narrative, to try and back up whatever claims are made with evidence. We hope to be able to have done that here. Such has been the concern about subsidies in the context of China's development that three big trading nations, Japan, the United States, and the EU, have got together and have formed a trilateral initiative to try and come up with new rules for the road on subsidies. Now, this initiative has run into the ground largely because the three cannot agree on what subsidies are in scope. But also that even if they could, I think there would be real questions as to whether or not China is going to buy into an initiative which is so transparently been designed to curb it and no one else. And so what we have, unfortunately, is both a knowledge gap and a dialogue of the deaf on subsidies, as was well epitomized by the recent Chinese trade policy review in Geneva, where essentially groups of countries just got together to hurl accusations, and there was no sense in which we were beginning to sort this out. So the view that we took at the Global Trade Alert was that now was the time to step back and collect a lot of information that we could on corporate subsidies by the big three trading powers. So don't just single out any one of them. Take a very even-handed approach and try and find as much information as you can about subsidies which are being paid by governments to firms. So we're not talking about subsidies to individuals in the welfare state. We're not talking about development aid. We're not talking about transfers of subsidies between levels of government. We're talking about subsidies received by companies. And we wanted to put together a huge inventory of these subsidies and then identify what the form and global reach of those subsidies were, try and assess that, and then more importantly, draw out the implications which for the policy debate among governments and among analysts to try and figure out where deliberation between countries could begin, with the goal, as you said, Karen, of trying to encourage cooperation on this topic. So that's how this study fits into the big picture in the trading system at the moment. Now, in order to make progress here, we have to take a position on what a subsidy is. And then what I'm going to do is to tell you what our main findings are, and then I'm going to draw out the policy implications in the short time that I have remaining. So you have to take a stance on what a subsidy is. Our take on this is extremely conventional. And the 4 characteristics of a subsidy are listed here. The first subsidy requires action by a public. The first requirement is that there must be an action by a public body. And we take a very expansive view about what a public body is. For those people who followed the WTO legal jurisprudence, that's really important, because the people fight over what public bodies give subsidies and which ones don't. We did not exclude certain types of public bodies a priori. We said, let's see where the evidence takes us. Secondly, there must be an outlay of public resources, either actually or potentially. So this means that guarantees offered by governments are within scope as well. Thirdly, the subsidy must confer an advantage on a firm. That is, the subsidy mustn't just be a payment for taking on some obligations. That's really important in the context of COVID-19, because there are a number of subsidy schemes where the subsidy is expected to pay firms' staff, and those staff were sent home from work. So in this sense, those types of subsidies do not confer a deliberate advantage to a firm, because they're literally acting as a vehicle for the welfare state payments to workers who've been sent home because of the pandemic. The last requirement that subsidies be selective is very important, and it aligns with the WTO notion of specificity of subsidies. There has to be some sense of the subsidy being targeted. Now, all of the subsidies that we documented in our inventory meet these 4 standards, and we documented 18,137 of these subsidies for the big 3 from the period November 2008 through to October 2021. When we looked across those subsidies, what did we find? We found 7 findings, which I will state each finding and then interpret the significance of them. The first finding is the corporate subsidies are not only awarded in crisis years. Now, how do we interpret this? I have been around the block in the trade policy world long enough to know that people who do not want to talk about a subject will always tell you it's unimportant, or the trade policy intervention only happens in exceptional times and we should overlook it. The point I want to make here is that even outside of crisis years, we see a lot of subsidization. Second finding, less than 1.1% of the subsidy changes that are observed involve reductions in subsidies or elimination of subsidies. So really the interpretation there is the bulk of the evidence that we have found is of increased subsidization by these 3 jurisdictions over time. Third, subsidies are not confined to agriculture. Agricultural subsidies are important, but they're not the only ones which are important. So we would put on the table services subsidies and subsidies to manufacturing firms. The fourth point is subsidies are not a feature of any one development model. The United States and the European Union are responsible for about 12,000 of the subsidies in our inventory. And so we cannot just pin subsidies on the Chinese development model. A more objective assessment requires that even market-based systems of governance make substantial resort to subsidies. The fifth observation is that the scale of trade potentially affected or covered by the subsidies of the big 3 is significant. We estimate conservatively that it was 62% of global goods trade in 2019, so before any of the pandemic subsidies hit. And please bear in mind that if we have missed any subsidies, if there are subsidies out there we haven't documented, this percentage, if anything, is going to go up, not down. So this is going to be a lower bound on the scale of global trade affected. And if someone comes to you with a problem which covers 62% of global goods trade, to me, that counts as a systemic issue that needs further elaboration. This penultimate point is that corporate subsidies are not just awarded to import competing firms who are trying to stave off efficient competitors. There is a growing amount of subsidization of exporters, of firms engaging in FDI decisions and acquisitions abroad. And this form of subsidies for overseas operations is something which is significant and covers substantial amounts of global goods trade as well. The last point, which ought to worry any trade policy analyst, is we found evidence of tit-for-tat dynamics in the behavior of the United States, the European Union, and China. That is, we found evidence that if, say, China puts in place a subsidy, within 6 months, or 12 months or 24 months, it's very likely that the US or the EU has put in place a subsidy or has put in place a trade barrier in the same products where the subsidy was issued by the Chinese. So if you look at a very fine grain level for tit for tat behavior, that is of accelerating trade distortions, you can find it. And this ought to be a source of concern.
So Simon, you have 2 minutes.
Great, because that's all I'm going to need for the last piece. So these are the main findings and their significance. What I think we need to do next is to have an informal policy dialogue on at least 4 substantive matters. The first is which subsidies are in scope, which are the ones we need to worry about and discuss because they cover a lot of trade or they're particularly distortive. Secondly, we need to question whether or not governments need to resort to subsidies so much and whether we can design subsidies in a way that is less trade distortive. My starting point here is that governments will continue to use subsidies either for the low carbon transition or for private sector development. And so then the question is, how can we design subsidies which are effective at home, but do not distort the world trading system as much? Third, we need to have an open discussion about developing a better subsidy information system. I don't just mean notifications here. Much of the information we have put together came directly from national sources, and I see no reason why that information cannot be used at the multilateral level. And the fourth thing we need to do is to assess whether the current WTO rules for subsidies are fit for purpose, whether there is a cooperation agenda which can be developed in the years ahead between governments. So these are the 4 things which need to be discussed in greater detail. Maybe we'll get into those in the webinar today. These discussions are things where academics can contribute, think tanks like the Heinrich Foundation can contribute, and also, of course, governments and business associations will have a lot to say about these issues too. And I think we need to now take that discussion forward, starting from a stronger evidence base than before we published our report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon, for a very insightful analysis. I truly agree with you that transparency is important to better this issue, and we should have a dialogue that is based on evidence. And you and your team has put up a very very comprehensive inventory on subsidies, which is really helpful to carry the discussion forward. So let's move on to Wei Huan. Let us turn to you first. I understand that you have advised Chinese government and also with your have extensive interactions with various producer and exporters. So it would be great if you could share with us today your views on the report, or your view on Chinese subsidy regime, etc. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen, for introduction. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thanks again, and thanks for Heinrich Foundation for inviting me to such a timely and informative event. And thanks, Simon, for this very comprehensive report. In my view, it's much needed nowadays as evidence. In my 8 minutes, I will focus on sharing some general observations about Chinese subsidies, the adequacy of WTO rules, which Simon mentioned, and also the ways for future negotiations, which most of my views, I think, well aligned with Simon's presentation and also the views in the report. But let me just start by concurring with Simon's findings and suggestions about the need to think about subsidies as a global issue so that we can deal with it in an objective manner. The data collected in the report leaves us with little doubt and strong evidence that we should not over-criticize subsidies by some, but not by those by others. Another point I agree entirely is the need to distinguish between good and bad subsidies, even though this is not an easy task. Coffee subsidies are a perfect example about why global trade rules need to achieve a balance between trade regulation and policy space. Both points have implications for trade negotiations, which I will say a little bit more later. China's industry subsidies and its use of subsidies and SOEs for such policies are widely documented. I shall not repeat the public knowledge, but let me just add a few observations, particularly on the adequacy of the WTO rules. First, my view is that the existing rules under WTO's subsidy agreements coupled with China's WTO plus obligations, may well be sufficient to deal with Chinese industry subsidies. I touch upon two elements under the general subsidy rules, and then I move briefly to the WTO plus obligations. First, subsidies must be in the form of financial contributions, as Simon mentioned. So China's industry subsidies may not as difficult to identify as usually believed due to the lack of transparency. And I guess the evidence, the fact that Simon and his team are able to identify an inventory shows that it's not really so untransparent in the Chinese market, even if it is sometimes very difficult to identify the subsidies. So I use the high-tech subsidies as an example because I wrote about it recently. The major Chinese subsidies in the high-tech sector are mainly in the form of grants, direct payments, policy loans and guarantees, equity infusion, provision and purchase of goods, sometimes through SOEs. These are all very typical forms of financial contributions, not difficult to establish under the subsidy agreement. Second, also Simon mentioned about the issue of public body. The challenge the criticism about the WTO law at the moment is about the panel body's authority-based approach to the determination of public body and the question of whether Chinese SOEs should be treated as public bodies. My argument is that I think the panel body never said that SOEs can't be public bodies. And I think the criticism about the panel body's approach has overstated the evidentiary difficulties in proving Chinese SOEs as public bodies. In both of the cases, the major two cases in which the panel body develops that authority-based approach, the panel body did not disagree with the investigating authorities that the China state banks and the state-owned enterprises providing inputs to manufacture were not public bodies. So I think perhaps we need to rethink about the conventional wisdom about the difficulties in proving public bodies and challenging Chinese subsidies in general. In addition to the general rules, China has made some very rigorous and extensive obligations that go far beyond the general WTO rules. For example, these rules allow other countries to use external benchmarks to determine benefits conferred, which can greatly facilitate the application of countervailing investigations. Even more broadly, these obligations also require the Chinese government to ensure that state-owned enterprises and state-invested enterprises, state entities in general, to operate on a non-discriminatory and purely commercial basis in their purchase and sale decisions. And that prices for traded goods and services in every sector to be determined by market forces. These obligations extend beyond the regulation of a particular policy instrument, such as subsidies, to constrain the conduct and behavior of state entities and government intervention that affects prices in general. So I think we need to rethink about the conventional wisdom and also think about, whether we do actually have rules to deal with China. Remember, none of these WTO plus obligations I've just mentioned have been used before. So I don't think that the criticism about the inadequacy of WTO rules is legitimate from that perspective. Now, let me just conclude with a few thoughts on future negotiations of industry subsidies, drawing on what I have just said at the very beginning. First of all, I think this is also Simon's point. I think the negotiations must not be disproportionately focused on China, and instead must focus on addressing trade distortive subsidies in all economies involved. And this means that we need to rethink about the proposals on the table, such as the US, EU, Japan joint statements, also Simon mentioned. Second, importantly, I think the negotiations need to strike a balance between tightening the regulation of subsidies and maintaining the flexibility to use subsidies for legitimate policy objectives. I think that should be appreciated, given the COVID subsidies that always can go different ways, including the impacts of the such subsidies, but also the policies-based governments need to use subsidies to achieve regulatory goals. Finally, I think this is the point I haven't actually seen be made in the public or in the academic and policy debates, which what I think that we need to accommodate the diverse economic and political conditions and needs in WTO countries. And that means that maybe we should think about whether the conventional approach applying general rules on all subsidies on all countries should still be the standard approach for future negotiations. And I would suggest that we may be considering a scheduling approach, like what we did for services and tariffs, to provide a country-specific schedule in the subsidy negotiations in the future. And this will require, every country to record, for example, the types of subsidies, the underlying policy objectives, as well as maybe some phase down and phase out periods, and also whether there will be any foreseeable circumstances in the future, similar or new subsidies may need to be reintroduced, and how much. So I'll just stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions in Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, Wei Huan, for very great comments on the report and about Chinese subsidy too. Now I'm looking at Gary, and I think he's also trying to still sort out the technical issues. So perhaps I just direct our way back to Simon, if you would like to respond to the points that Wei Huan raised, and you're welcome to do so.
So thank you, and thank you for Wei Huan for his comments. I think I'm broadly, not surprisingly, broadly sympathetic to him. I like the way that he juxtaposes the so-called good versus bad subsidies. Maybe I would come at it slightly differently by stepping back a question and asking the prior question, really, which is, when do we need subsidies or not? Right. So this will come up, I think, very much when we start talking about climate change and the transition to a low carbon economy. It's, I think, pretty much a consensus amongst many economic analysts that governments should have high carbon prices and raising higher carbon prices over time. But those carbon prices seem to have questionable political acceptability. And as a result, governments are defaulting to using second and third best types of subsidies. And so I think we also need to have a discussion about when should subsidies be used versus other policy instruments. And this might actually help clarify even better the good versus bad distinction as well. So I think we need to put on the table the necessity of subsidies, as well as the trade distortive nature of them as well. So I would frame it, I think, slightly differently. I think Wei Huan's framing of this is much more conventional and standard. And so I can absolutely understand why he uses the good versus bad distinction. But I think we need to go back a step and ask, why should subsidies be used in the first place when other tools could provide strong incentives, for example, for adopting technologies which reduce the CO2 emissions?
All right, thank you so much, Simon, for your response. So I think I just would like to remind you in the audience that you can submit your question in the Q&A box. So you just click the Q&A function below, the button below, to post your question. So I think we're waiting for Gary. Are you able to join us now? I think you have to unmute yourself first.
Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, excellent. So yes, so we have been waiting for your comments.
I understand that.
Yes, thank you. So I just want to repeat my question. So for you, Gary, I understand that you have watched subsidy regimes for over a decade. So it would be great if you can share with us your views on these developments, please. Thank you.
Okay. Well, from what I heard from Simon, he emphasized a point which I think is really very, very important, and that's the importance of transparency. It's a fundamental element to correct for any malfunctioning of the global trading system, and better information on subsidies is really critical to determine the incidence and magnitude of the prevailing subsidies. And this is precisely what the report does. I mean, what was quite interesting for me is that thinking about this evening's session, I looked again at past notes on subsidies, and I had a look at the WTO trade report of 2006, which is called Exploring the Links Between Subsidies, Trade and the WTO. And in the introduction, there's an introduction by Pascal Lamy, who was the Director General of the WTO at the time. And he said the extraordinary paucity of reliable and systematic information on subsidies means it is simply impossible to make good policy or to forge mutually beneficial international cooperation in the absence of information. Now, for me, this is what this report is all about. It's using data-driven approaches rather than qualitative approaches to try to identify what are the elements that could eventually become what are new and better ways to deal with subsidies within the context of the WTO, in particular, which is my focus. But that brings us to a point also which Simon raised in what I heard about the notification of subsidies. Now, this works very, very poorly at the WTO. I looked at the last minutes of minutes of the last meeting of the Subsidies Committee. And for the past year, the date of submissions of notifications was the 30th of June, and only 109 members had notified any subsidies. For 2019, 78 members notified or hadn't notified, and 67 hadn't notified in 2017, which means in the notification process, I think it's important for us to understand why, in fact, countries don't notify. Is it data constraints, or a lack of understanding of the definition of subsidies, or the concept of specificity, or being concerned about giving information which would be incriminating for them at a later stage? So, in my view, there's an expression that's used in a different context in the report, is that people in glass houses don't throw stones. So there's probably also an element of countries not wanting to incriminate themselves. Or another point is that subsidies, when they're notified ex post. That's to say that the legislation is already in place. And therefore, it takes time to notify what is existing legislation, basically. But if we turn to the activity within the WTO, now the subsidies have taken a very, very high profile for a number of reasons, with the fishery subsidies, which is now under discussion tonight in Geneva. These are 20 years in the making. The last draft that I saw was dated the 8th of November, and I think this would be a tragedy if this agreement wasn't struck. And similarly with, in terms of duration, other subsidies which have taken a high profile, Boeing Airbus is another example. That's been 20 years in the making. And the way it's been settled is to give 5 years for further consideration while the penalty tariffs are being held in abeyance. Also, New Zealand has now launched an initiative along with a number of other countries, 15 other countries, for the WTO to look at coal subsidies. So subsidies certainly within the WTO or globally has a very high profile. But when we look at activity within the WTO, and I'd like to come back to the transparency point here, that if we look at the number of inquiries into subsidies over the past 25 years, inquiries which have been initiated by governments who are concerned about subsidies which are adversely affecting them or causing them injury one way or another, there have been 632 initiations of inquiries, and only 344 countervailing duty measures were actually applied. So going through to the stage of the application of the measures was only half of the initiation of the inquiries. Now, for me, that doesn't seem like many. If we look at anti-dumping, for example, there have been 6,300 initiations of inquiries and 4,071 measures applied. So what conclusion can we draw from that? Well, we can draw different conclusions, but one thing that points to me is, in fact, one of the reasons may well be we simply don't have the information. And once again, we come back to the importance of transparency and also the importance of having a database like the database which Simon has just presented and has prepared with Johannes and his team is absolutely critical at this point of time to move forward in a positive manner, dealing with what Simon just said, subsidies which affect one way or another. If I got the number right, 62% of global trade, one way or another, is affected by subsidies, which is a far cry from the rather, well, the paucity of notifications which we get at the WTO. There's something there which for me is quite out of kilter. Also, when we go to the question of, for example, for dispute settlement, again, I speak of the Australian case, and we haven't had a lot of cases, 134. I don't think that's so many, but most of them, one way or another, dealing principally with dumping and not really about countervailing duties. The Australian wine and barley cases which we have with China at the moment, in fact, only looking at what the duties, the penalty duties have been put forward, it's 116% to 218% anti-dumping duties on wine, whereas there is just 6.3% countervailing duties, and eventually those countervailing duties have been dropped in the panel inquiry. So, principal point that I would guess I'd like to make is that notifications, we don't have enough of them, we should have more, that this report fills an absolutely critical gap, and hopefully we can carry things forward. I think that Simon is absolutely right. What we need is an informed policy dialogue. Governments in the totality of things and have no appetite for a WTO work program that requires each nation to participate and to engage in reform. We should look for a coalition of the willing, of WTO members who are prepared to forge ahead as long as they don't impair the interests of others. Plurilateral agreements is one way to go. Another is to look at regional agreements like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the revamped Trans-Pacific Partnership. Article 17 of this regional trade agreement has very comprehensive requirements with respect to state-owned enterprises, for example, and subsidies in general. So in the far as that's concerned, I think that I liked very much in the report, I'll read the text, which says that the report rather modestly says that there's not anything inherently wrong with trade liberalization, but that's not the focus of the report. There's nothing inherently wrong with trade liberalization in our view. It's worth noting that the sectoral accords considered in this report are not really liberalizing. They merely seek to remove the silt clogging up the world trading system over the past decade. Now, I think that's a very, very good way to put the current situation with respect to subsidies and the incidence of subsidies, which has been revealed in the report that Simon and Johannes put together. Just in perhaps a more positive frame in terms of role of the WTO, I'm not nearly as pessimistic as some about the future of the WTO or the future of governments in the WTO, turning to seriously looking as to what they can do with respect to subsidies. But I do think that plurilateral routes is a way to go. I do think that a critical mass is important in drawing conclusions as to how things can be carried forward, and in was plurilateral agreements, being sure that in fact no other trading partners are adversely affected by the agreements that are being struck, also that they're open-ended, and eventually other countries can join on to the plurilateral agreements which have been agreed to by a smaller number of WTO participants, and who knows, eventually maybe those plurilateral agreements will become multilateralized. Okay, so that's what my presentation, and I'm sorry it's so messy, but we did have such a difficulty with
no problem.
trying to make connection vocally. So there we are.
Thank you, Gary. It's very, very great to have you back, and great comments as always. So maybe I'd like to go back to Simon. So if you have any, if you want to say something in response to what Gary just said, then please do so.
I'll keep it brief. Thank you. I am strongly in agreement with Gary's approach, and in particular his comments about the need for transparency. I too read, or rather reread, the World Trade Report of 2006 and found Pascal Lamy's forward to that report extremely prescient. I mean, it was really absolutely on target. And he highlighted that we just can't talk about this unless we have serious evidence base to draw from, and I think the last few years have shown this. I think the attacks on China over capacity, and then steel, and then the trilateral initiative has shown that essentially once this discussion gets too divorced from the underlying facts, it just doesn't proceed. So we have to have a new approach, and I'd be very interested in working on what that new approach would be with others. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Then let's move on to the Q&A session. So while we're waiting for the questions from the audience to come in, I think I'm gonna take this opportunity to ask the first question then. So Simon, I would like to, it's great, a great presentation, great report, as I mentioned earlier. And I just would like to encourage you to talk about what will likely to happen in the next 2 years. As we know, the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as other transnational problems, such as, cyber attacks or cyber warfare, have tempted governments to roll out protectionist measures for national security purposes. So it seems to be like a trend in that direction. So with this thing in mind, so what could we expect to see in the next 2 years with regard to subsidies?
So let me start by agreeing with you that I think the theme of security, not just national security, economic security, security of supply of medical goods and the like, will be one of the compelling themes of the next couple of years. The question I think before us is how much that theme translates into initiatives, largely industrial policy initiatives, which are funded through subsidies. Now, if we had gone back 12 months, the rhetoric on this was extremely elevated, and you might have feared an outpouring of subsidization in this domain. We have seen some subsidies in these areas, but not as much as we might think. But still, I think the theme of security will be there. It will then, of course, influence any discussion on subsidies, because some governments will want to maintain some degree of flexibility in the way that Wei Wan has suggested. But I don't think the issue of security trumps a discussion on subsidies. I think the scale of subsidies has become so big, and I think people realize that independently it's become a source of tension, that surely we have the collective ingenuity to figure out how we can increase the security or the resilience of our economic and health systems without destroying the trading system. And I think that there's enough good people out there who would be, I think, willing to think about that particular project. Now, you ask more generally about the prospects for subsidies. The COVID recovery is a very interesting phase, because we are going to see, well, let us hope that we get into the recovery phase for sure, right? Assuming we do, then many governments are going to find that their public finances, which have been shattered because of this, or stretched, let's put it more diplomatically, there will need to be retrenchment. And this might actually provide an opportunity to get finance ministries on board with an agenda of scaling back subsidy offerings. And so we have found in some other sectors, steel is actually a good example, that when governments retrench on the fiscal front, they ask hard questions about subsidies. Since many governments will be retrenching on the fiscal front at the same time, we might use this actually as an opportunity to align the trade ministries with the finance ministries, and often trump the industry ministries, who of course like the subsidies. So I would argue that there's a unique, potentially unique moment here in the trade politics, which we might be able to galvanize on, assuming of course we can get governments talking again about this subject.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Simon. And Wei Huan and Gary, if you have anything to add, please jump in.
Yeah, I think that sorry, where we go on subsidies is going to depend entirely on government's priorities for the future. And assigning priorities depends on what importance, of course, governments will assign to doing something to make the system work better with respect to subsidies. And again, I come back here, information about how serious the problem is critical. But in the final analysis, it really is when governments look at what the future agenda is going to be for them, and then what is the priority which they will assign to each of those. So that's really is the bottom line.
Thank you, Gary. And Wei Huan, please.
Just one point. China applied to join the CPTPP. That suggests to me that maybe China, after several years of studies of the CPTPP, no longer thinks the CPTPP sets out very high standard that can actually be achieved. So that includes what Gary mentioned about Chapter 17 of the SOE chapter, and also the subsidy rules. Now, I think we need to kind of think about the CPTPP high standard rules as opposed to the existing WTO obligations, as I have just mentioned, whether these actually extend beyond the WTO rules. My assessment is that perhaps the most advanced rule under the CPTPP SOE chapter, including subsidies, is transparency and notification. So in that sense, I think it's a good sign that China is waiting to join, and that shows China is waiting to make the subsidy programs more transparent, as well as the SOEs. So I think that's a good sign. As I think Gary said, if you have a expanding plurilateral agreements that includes the major players, that may actually translate into multilateral negotiation, which is what I want to see as well.
Thank you, Wei Huan. We have a question from the audience. This question comes from Maria Moreno Central. So I'm going to read what she wrote down here. So she said, good morning. Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. I would like to ask, why do they prefer a plurilateral solution that multilateralizes rather than a multilateral solution? So I think this question goes to all of you, if you would like to chip in. Thank you.
Well, I think the multilateral solution is difficult across the board now, because with 164 members of the WTO, for example, that the decisions which are based on consensus have become extraordinarily difficult. And what we've seen is, of course, the fragmentation of the multilateral system with a proliferation of regional agreements where a smaller number of countries can come together. Here again, I come back to the modified Trans-Pacific Partnership and China's application to join, which will be interesting because state trading is one of the major articles within that agreement. But the simple answer is it's very difficult at this stage to get multilateral agreement. So start with a smaller number, the critical mass, which Simon and Simon's report refers to. Start with the critical mass, keep it open-ended, then build to a multilateral agreement eventually, hopefully.
Yes, Simon and Wei Huan, would you like to chip in?
Yes, just to say, if I may, that I think in trade policy discussions these days, we have to separate out between what we would wish for if we had everything we wanted and what we're likely to get. And I think this pragmatism is required. And so I would indeed start with something which involves a well-intentioned effort by hopefully a number of significant players to at least talk about this issue and then make progress beyond there. I think we are not in a position, or rather, let me put it this way. I think if we went to a situation of trying to launch a multilateral negotiation on subsidies right now, it would probably go nowhere. And so I think we have to do our homework first. And I know that's frustrating and for people who want to make progress, but we are where we are. And I think that's the reality we have to work with.
Yes, Wei Huan, would you like to say something?
Just very briefly, I haven't seen any concrete proposals in relation to industry subsidy negotiations at the WTO, except for the joint statements by the US, EU, and Japan. And I have said in my presentation, I don't think that's going to work because China would not actually agree to it. So you need to kind of consider the interests from all participants, not only the big ones, but you have to consider the diverse interests in all countries, 164 members. So that's the difficulty. Now, one of the proposals I said in my presentation, I did not have time to elaborate, was whether we can actually consider a scheduling approach so that you can give countries the flexibility to schedule their subsidies. And I mean, obviously the devil is in the details, but you need to give countries the flexibility to use the subsidies for a variety of objectives. Now, let me just get very briefly to what Simon commented on bad and good subsidies. I totally agree that we need to consider the first best and the second best policy instruments. And the standard economics says that subsidies typically offer an optimal solution. And I guess my limited knowledge on economics is that whether we can actually apply the specificity and targeting rule by thinking about whether a subsidy adopted actually targets or addresses the problem at its core. And will that be an approach to draw a distinction between good and bad?
Okay, thank you, Wei Huan. We have another question from the audience. This is from Adam Corral, so I'm gonna read the question now. The question is, what or can ASEAN have a more active role in influencing a more agreed outcome for US-China tariffs, etc.? So what would your thoughts on this? So I think these questions go to all of you, if you'd like to chip in. So the question, yes, please.
No, I'll leave it to one of the China
Okay, sure. So the question is, what or can ASEAN have a more active role in influencing a more agreed outcome for US-China tariffs? This is about ASEAN, I think.
Yes, I can say, I mean, I'll say a few things. I'm not an ASEAN expert, but I do watch closely the US-China discussions, or rather the dialogue of the death, which might be a better way of talking about it. I'm not sure that any of us outside of those two jurisdictions can play much of a role until these two big players start talking to each other in a way where they can build trust. I'm sure all of us outside would turn around and hope that they could find an accommodation and find a way forward. But I think we are still in the post-Trump recovery phase. And from what we've seen of the Biden administration, there are some serious doubts about their willingness to engage as well, or at least the terms upon which they're willing to engage. So I think this is going to be, for Adam, I'm afraid, a spectator sport, like for the rest of us. But we must wish that the two protagonists can find some common ground, at least start talking to each other in a way which starts separating out fact from fiction.
Thank you. And Wei Huan, would you like to say something about this?
I think my position is very similar to Simon's. I'm not sure. Now, if ASEAN countries can actually play a role, they should have already played a role during the past 2.5 or 3 years. But yet, I agree with Simon. I think these external forces did not and cannot in the future, unlikely in the future, can actually affect the decisions and interactions between the two superpowers. But one point I want to make is about the managed trade and the trade diversion effects of the U.S.-China agreement. And we have started seeing this kind of trade diversion from Australia and from other countries. So would that actually provide sufficient political incentive in the different jurisdictions or countries for them to play a role? I'm not sure, but we will see.
Thank you, Wei Huan. We only have a few minutes left here, so I'm going to wrap up this session. So I'd like to thank you all again, all three of you, for your insightful analysis and very lively discussion about subsidies and the trend going forward. And also, I would like to thank you, all of you in the audience as well, for joining us today. And as I noted earlier in this session, the recording of this webinar will be available on Heinrich Foundation's website next week. So you can check it out on the website again next week. And also, I would like to invite everyone to please visit the Heinrich Foundation's website at www.heinrichfoundation.com for the latest insight on sustainable global trade. And with that, let me close this webinar and wish you all a wonderful day and evening ahead. Thank you again, and we hope to see you next time.